In the first episode of this series, I explained how a year or so ago I challenged religious fundamentalists, biblical literalists, science-denying creationists to show that there is any truth to their position at all. Any actual factual evidence that we can both objectively verify to be real and true, which is also indicative of and or exclusively concordant with their preferred delusion. I got no answer to that challenge, not back when I originally made it, nor from any of the hornets that I stirred up with the new reminder. Because that is the answer. They know there is no evidence that they can point to that either isn't even factual, or that isn't just distorted data. Because there is no truth to creationism whatsoever. Creationism is made of misunderstood, misinformation, misrepresented, deliberately deceptively in defense of delusion. In the second episode of this series, I challenged creationists more than a decade ago to present the evidence that they pretend to have for their claim of created kinds, clades of collective species that were magically conjured out of nothing by God's incantation rather than evolving naturally like we know that life really does. Again, there was no answer, neither back then nor at any time since then, nor in the comments of the recent reminder either. At different points over that range of time, a couple people posted videos pretending to address this challenge, but each of them also showed that they were so stupid they didn't even understand what the challenge is, so there was no intelligible answer given. These three challenges are actually in reverse order. And now I'm looking back at the first formal challenge I ever issued to creationists. It wasn't a year ago, nor a decade ago, but toward the end of the 20th century, when Prince thought that he would have his last party. Back when I was still so naive as to think that creationists came to their conclusions honestly, and that they were rational enough to change their minds once you show them the truth, what we can actually show to be true, I offered to prove evolution even to their satisfaction. This was originally in answer to the convicted fraud and charlatan Kent Hovind. Before he spent a decade in prison for tax fraud, Hovind challenged evolutionists to provide evidence of evolution. That was the posted challenge, anyway. But if you clicked on the link to accept the challenge, as I did, then you came to the bait and switch, where the next page said that Hovind's challenge was not to provide facts and evidence that support evolutionary biology or phylogenetics. No. Rather, he demanded proof, not evidence, but absolute proof that God could not have done it. Not evidence that God didn't do it, but proof that he couldn't have done it. You want evidence of evolution? Fine. I've got literally tons of it. But how am I supposed to prove what a being made of magic can or cannot do? The only way to do that would be to disprove God, to prove a negative, a feat that would be logically impossible given these conditions. This is how we know that Kent Hovind knows that he is a liar, that he is just another con man using religion to dupe the credulous like all the professional apologists do. For the most part, creationist apologists are just stupid liars who lie stupidly, especially those who are celebrated for their supposedly superior intelligence. The Ian Jubies, Charles Jacksons, Grady McMurtrys, and Kent Hovinds out there. Those idiots will give you some of the dumbest arguments you ever heard. But I am neither stupid nor a liar. I neither tell lies like they do, nor am I foolish enough to believe in lies like they do. I am sincere, and getting to the truth matters to me. So ever since Y2K or thereabouts, I have been posing a challenge to creationists that I will prove evolution even to their satisfaction. I have to phrase it that way because some people think that until it's proven that it's only a theory, as if a theory is no more than a guess, and then if it's ever proven to be true, then it will become a law. But no, all of that is wrong. In science, a theory is a body of knowledge explaining all of the facts, hypotheses, and natural laws within the given field of study. Everything we know to be true in science is a theory. There is nothing above a theory. That is the highest level of confidence science is allowed to have, because when you start claiming absolute truth, it's often when you start lying. That's why science has a rule that nothing can ever be proven in the positive sense, because science considers proof to be absolute and thus limited to mathematics. That's part of why atomic theory is still just a theory. Whatever we know and can show to be true, is never more than a theory. And natural laws can be contained within a theory, but they can never be higher or more than a theory. So we're not using the word proof in an absolute sense, but in a provisional sense, like a courtroom would use. I will prove evolution to your satisfaction by providing an overwhelming preponderance of evidence beyond reasonable doubt. Now, it would not do for me to bombard you with volumes of evidence and expect you to read it all. Believers usually won't read any of it. Nor would it do for me to present any of my 100 or so detailed videos explaining different aspects of evolution. Believers won't watch it. No, they will only respond to direct personal communication. So this will require a Socratic interaction, where we each present our evidence and arguments and where we each have to answer the other's questions. That is critically important, because this challenge requires that you understand what I'm telling you, and not just at the end. I need to confirm that you understood and accept the basics that I just explained before we move on to any of the more advanced steps in the stairway out of delusion. It would not do for me to harass you or disrespect your time. I know that creationists have tried to overwhelm their interlocutors with incessant arguments and long blocks of copy pasta that are all just false or fallacious claims, trying to control the narrative and bore their opposition into submission with endless daily tedium of nonsense forever until their opponent either gives up or blocks them. I won't be like that, so I gave a time limit that within a couple dozen mutual exchanges, that's 24 posts from me answered by you and vice versa, I will prove evolution is the only explanation for biodiversity, scientific or otherwise, and that it is the truest and best explanation for the origin of our species. While as a bonus, the creationist will, perhaps unwittingly, demonstrate how creationism depends entirely on fraudulent, false, or fallacious claims that they can neither substantiate nor defend. If someone offered to prove God or creationism to me, I'd be all ears. But you're not going to do that by shifting the burden of proof based on whatever you think science doesn't or can't explain. Yours is not the default position. Because even if science doesn't yet explain this or that, guess what? Religion doesn't explain it either. If we didn't know the answer yet, that doesn't mean it was magic. Magic is not an explanation of anything, and that's all you have. You can't just expect us to assume a God because we don't know any better. You still have to show that there's a there, that your God is the right answer, that there is some substance to creationism, such as I am prepared to show for evolution, and that you can't show for creationism. So we'll have a back and forth, where I present a small body or category of facts and evidence for evolution, and you won't have any for creationism. All you can do is say, nuh-uh. But I can show objectively verifiable documentation that I got it right, and that Answers in Genesis or ICR or whatever other anti-science propaganda mill you're copying, pasting from, got everything wrong. Then we'll go into the next round and repeat that with another set of facts and evidence for evolution, and maybe a different lie for creationism, and so on to the next round, if need be. All of that really depends on the individual. Fundamentalists often react to such proof by resorting to whataboutisms, deflecting away from whatever evidence they cannot dismiss or discredit, but that their faith won't allow them to honestly admit, by changing the subject to something else, usually to something that isn't even evolution at all, but something else entirely. No, we're not doing that. I have to explain that we are only talking about evolutionary theory, the scientific explanation of biodiversity, meaning that we're talking about population genetics, fossils, and phylogeny. We are not talking about Big Bang cosmology, because whether the universe had a beginning or not would not change the fact that we are evolving apes either way, and that the scriptures of every religion are still just man-made mythology. We are not talking about the origin of life either. If you can't understand something relatively simple like evolution, then you're certainly not going to be able to comprehend abiogenesis, because that is a much more complex sequence of largely unrelated processes in different chemical environments. Learn to walk before you try to run. Understand evolution first, then abiogenesis will be a lot easier to understand. So for this challenge, we are not talking about how life emerged, we are instead talking about how living things evolve. Neither are we talking about atheism or philosophical naturalism. Even if there was a God, evolution would still be verifiably real and true, and biblical creationism would still be already falsified folklore. Not even the existence of God would change either of these facts. You can still make believe in God and Jesus on faith, while also accepting objectively verifiable realities like evolution. If you think that disproving the Bible means disproving God, then you can't distinguish doctrine from deity, which means you're a bibliolater. You don't worship a God so much as you worship a book that is supposed to be about God, but was written by mere fallible men who obviously did not know what they were talking about. Neither are we talking about Scripture. I can go there too, and you don't want me there either. Stay on topic. For this challenge, we are only talking about evolution, not anything or everything else. I've made this challenge as easy for them as possible. I have taken the burden of proof entirely on myself, and I can't even meet my own challenge without the contender admitting that I have, which would come sooner than they think. I doubt we would ever need to take it to the limit of mutual exchanges. But what usually happens is that when I make this challenge in whatever venue, believers scatter like cockroaches when you turn the light on. If they react to my post with a laugh emoji, I take that as an indication of immaturity and an admission of insincerity, that they're only trolling to waste my time. The few who do begin to engage me quickly disappear when they realize that everything got too real too fast. I once got into it with this one guy who, on his own bulletin board, which he deleted the entire thing just a couple of rounds in so that I couldn't even reach him again. I searched his handle and found a post from him on another board where he admitted to a third party that he deleted our whole discussion once he realized that I was making sense. Because to some people, it is more important to believe in a lie than to know the truth, and those people can still make believe in that lie even when they know it's not the truth. That's why creationists so often ask me what's wrong with lying in an attempt to defend deception. So now I try to secure a promise of commitment, someplace where I can keep a record of the fact that they agreed to these terms, so that they don't just run away. Not that it matters, they still don't have any accountability. I have been offering this challenge for a quarter of a century, and I am surprised that only a scant few, maybe only once a year, some believer is bold enough to accept and engage. But whenever they do, the pitiful few who accept the challenge will still shrink like vampires from the light of reason, especially when they know that others are reading and following along. With only one exception, all of them defaulted early on, and always the same way. Remember, this is supposed to be a Socratic interaction where you ask me questions and I will give you the best possible answers to that. I ask you a couple of questions and you give me whatever answers you understand. That's how we do. But creationists only ask questions that they don't want the answers to, and then only when they hope that there is no answer. There is never any honest inquiry. But more importantly, they habitually refuse to answer any of the very few direct questions I put to them. Even when I remind them that this is the fourth or fifth or sixth time that I've had to repeat the same question, will you please get me your answer now so that we may continue to the next round? Because they always fail with a faceplant right at the start, usually within the first couple of posts. One guy thought that he could run out the clock by ducking and dodging and distracting for several rounds without ever answering or admitting anything, until near the end when I explained to him that a mutual interaction means a question asked and answered. Only then do we move on to the next interaction. So understand that if you repeatedly fail or refuse to answer or adequately address any of the direct points or queries put to you after being reminded of them multiple times, or if you lie in your reply, as can be objectively confirmed, then you will default disagreement, and I will be under no further obligation to continue. A couple other guys thought that they could hold out by repeatedly asserting their favorite lies, that evolutionary classrooms teach godlessness, or they cite their strawman distortion that evolution requires a change in kinds. I showed lesson plans that prove otherwise, some of them even from Christian teachers. Even if there was such a thing as a kind, which there isn't, but even if there was still never any point in evolutionary history where one kind of thing was ever supposed to change into or give birth to another fundamentally different kind of thing. That would actually violate two of the natural laws of evolution. So stop lying about what evolution is. If you can't show documentation from any professor or syllabus or lesson plan from any secular science educational source, then you do not get to say that they teach what you can only pretend that they do. You're still lying. There is no formula for this challenge. Every exchange is personally unique, with the single exception that I've learned that I have to start with the definition of what evolution is and isn't. And that's the biggest problem. That's what usually stops contenders in their tracks. That was the case earlier this month when some idiot troll creationist posted this image to a private group on Facebook where Christians debate unbelievers.
No theory of evolution can survive these two words. Prove it.
To which I replied, challenge accepted. I then had to explain that there is only one theory of evolution, and I had to link him to an academic science education source confirming what evolution is as it is actually taught, both in high school and in higher education. The University of California at Berkeley posted an introductory primer called Evolution 101. They define evolution as follows. Biological evolution, simply put, is descent with inherited modification. This definition encompasses everything from small-scale microevolution, for example, changes in the frequency of different gene versions in a population from one generation to the next, to large-scale macroevolution, for example, the descent of different species from a shared ancestor over many generations. That clear and simple definition, which is paraphrased by other institutions but still consistent with and essentially the same as this one, ruins the creationist position right at the start, because it accurately defines micro and macroevolution and unifies them, because they are exactly the same thing, just at different levels. Creationists also like to say that that's not evolution, that's just adaptation. But this same site also defines adaptation as evolution via natural selection. So there's another bullshit distortion the science deniers can't use. It doesn't have to be from that university either. It's the most concise because it was written at the high school level for beginners, but I could also cite this one from Princeton University. Evolution, descent with modification, transformation of species through time, including both changes that occur within species, microevolution, as well as the origin of new species, which is macroevolution. Notice that even though it is phrased differently, it still says the same thing, descent with modification, which contradicts the creationist claim of one kind turning into another fundamentally different kind. This definition also not only covers evolution as a whole, but both of its subcategories, micro and macro. And then there's this one from the University of Oklahoma. The theory of evolution explains the mechanisms, e.g. non-random natural selection acting on random mutation, by which organisms change over time, microevolution, become more complex and diversify into new species, macroevolution. Evolution is the central unifying theory of biology, supported by independent evidence from paleontology, geology, genetics, molecular biology, and genomics, developmental biology, biogeography, and behavioral ecology. Even though new information from nearly every field of science has been applied, attempts to falsify evolutionary theory using the scientific method have failed. As is true for any active science, the details of the theory are continually debated as new data are collected. However, there is no controversy in the scientific community about the fact of evolution. Biological evolution, defined as genetic change in species over time, is an observable fact. This one, too, unifies and identifies micro and macro, but I don't use this phrasing because it's unfair to get someone to agree when the definition includes the claim that it's correct. I want believers to figure that out as we go along. I could also cite the National Center for Science Education. Evolution can be precisely defined as any change in the frequency of alleles within a gene pool from one generation to the next. Though that one is not a college or university. The phrasing I prefer is implied here, but not explicitly enough for the level of uneducated, indoctrinated dolts I'm dealing with. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is not a scientific source, so I can't use it. It also gives multiple definitions, so you might think it was inconsistent, but it also explains why only one definition applies in this discussion. Evolution may be defined as any net directional change or any cumulative change in the characteristics of organisms or populations over many generations. In other words, descent with modification. It explicitly includes the origin as well as the spread of alleles, variants, trait values, or character states. But again, with only one exception, every single time I post the definition of evolution from any source, I follow that with a question, which is the first and only question of that first post. Do you understand and accept these definitions, explanations, and clarifications above as being how evolution is really being taught? Believers almost never accept that. Every creationist always, at least initially, insists that evolution means something else, that the theory of evolution is something else, though they can never substantiate that claim either, because they can never cite any academic institution teaching secular science that defines evolution the way creationists do. So I have to explain that you can't just say no, that you don't accept the definition even after being given proof that this actually is how evolution actually is being taught. And this last guy on Facebook said that he rejected all my descriptions and definitions without any reason why, apparently because that's not what he wants to believe that evolution is, and because he only knows how to argue against a straw man distortion of evolution, not what it really is. So this is where I have to waste an exchange to explain that since we are talking about science now, and not just a different opinion or conflict of worldviews, then you have to explain why you reject whatever you do. I should expect a different reason for each objection, and each of those explanations of objections have to be based on their merits in science, because that's what we're talking about now, not your religious beliefs. If you reject the definition of evolution, then you must quote another definition from another secular academic science source that defines evolution better or significantly differently, and you have to explain how it is better or why the difference matters. Believers never even try to do that because they know all they have are lies and nothing else. They know that no professor at any secular institution teaches that farcical parody of evolution that creationist pseudoscience types want to believe that they do. As I said, after all these years, nearly every creationist suffers a faceplant on that very first post of what evolution is. And most of the rest bail on the second post, which is usually about how evolution works, when they refuse to accept college lessons teaching that mutations really are the ultimate source of new information in the genome, because their know-nothing, willfully ignorant bigot of a preacher said otherwise. Only once has any creationist ever taken this challenge and seen it through. Though I cannot say that the challenge was ever met by a creationist, because by the end, she wasn't one anymore, because I did prove evolution to her satisfaction. As a result, she stopped teaching English in Christian school and started teaching science in public school. Then she went on to get a master's degree in science writing. All that started about 18 years ago, just a year or two before we got married. So creationism is demonstrably, indefensibly false. There is no actual factual evidence for it, but we do have plenty of substantial evidence against it. There are no logically valid arguments for it either, since every argument depends on false premises, and their conclusions are usually non sequitur. So there is no truth to creationism whatsoever, nothing they can show to be both true and indicative of their position. Creationism is made of irrational lies and illogical nonsense. That's literally all there is to it. So yes, arguing against something as stupid and unreasonable as creationism is ridiculous, but there are still grifters out there duping patsies, deceiving and depleting them for power and profit. I'm not here for the apologists. They're not going to honestly admit or correct anything. They're invested in the easiest and most lucrative scam ever invented, and they have now secured political leverage at every level of state and federal government. And they mean to use that leverage to forcibly impose their prejudice, propaganda, and prohibitions onto everyone else. So instead of the free country we once were, with a secular government where we have freedom of speech and thought and religion, those rights are all being taken away, as we are being reduced to an authoritarian regime which ultimately threatens to enforce biblical law, which is just as bad as Sharia. I'm here to help out the victims of these immoral scammers and dangerous despots, to reason believers back into reality for their own emotional, intellectual, physical, and political benefit, while it is still legal and I am still able to do that.